People say trust is the cornerstone of a strong marriage, and for years, I believed ours was unshakable. My wife, Olivia, was my partner in every sense of the word. Her laughter could brighten the gloomiest of days, and her unwavering support made me feel like the luckiest man alive, or so I thought. The first crack appeared on an otherwise unremarkable day. She was engrossed in her phone, fingers tapping away with an urgency I'd only ever seen in a crisis. "Who's that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She glanced up, startled, like a kid caught sneaking cookies before dinner. "Oh, just work," she said with a quick smile. But it wasn't her usual warm, effortless smile. It felt practiced, like she'd rehearsed it. I didn't press her. I just nodded, but in that moment, a tiny seed of doubt was planted in my mind. That seed grew faster than I expected. Little things began to stand out, subtle shifts I might have missed if I hadn't started paying closer attention. She started leaving earlier in the mornings and coming home later at night. Weekends that were once hours to spend together were now filled with errands that somehow stretched on for hours. And then there was the perfume. Olivia had always been a one spritz and done kind of woman, but lately, she'd started dousing herself in it. At first, I chalked it up to her wanting to boost her confidence. Who was I to judge if she wanted to feel good about herself? Then there was the night she came home late. I'd made her favorite meal, chicken, but when she walked in, she barely looked at it. "I'm not hungry," she mumbled, offering a weak smile before heading upstairs. She didn't seem tired, though. If anything, she looked refreshed, her cheeks flushed, her lips slightly swollen. She claimed she'd been working late, but no spreadsheet in the world could explain the glow she had. You might be wondering why I didn't confront her then and there. Believe me, I wanted to. But there's a fine line between suspicion and proof, and I wasn't about to leap to conclusions without hard evidence. Besides, I've always believed that people reveal their true selves when they think no one is paying attention. So, I decided to watch. Nothing invasive, just keeping an eye on the little details. That's how I found the receipt. It was tucked between the couch cushions while I was cleaning the living room. Dinner for two at a fancy downtown restaurant. I flipped it over, hoping for some kind of innocent note scribbled on the back, but it was blank. Olivia hadn't mentioned going out that week. I didn't say anything, though. Not yet. The final nail in the coffin came when her phone buzzed one evening. She was in the shower, and the screen lit up on the coffee table. The message preview read, "Can't wait to see you again." No name, just a number. My stomach twisted into knots, and for a moment, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. But I didn't touch the phone. I didn't storm into the bathroom, demanding answers. Instead, I smiled. I know, it sounds strange, but there's a peculiar power in holding the truth before someone knows you've uncovered it. At that moment, I didn't know who the other person was or how far things had gone. But I did know one thing for sure. Olivia, my wife, was hiding something. It was almost laughable, really. She thought she was so clever, weaving her web of lies right under my nose. But the thing about webs? The bigger they get, the easier they are to break. All I had to do was wait for the right moment. They say trust is the foundation of every marriage, and maybe that's true. But when trust is shattered, the entire foundation crumbles. And Olivia? She was about to learn just how good I was at rebuilding on my own. I kept my distance, tailing them cautiously. They ended up at a restaurant downtown, the exact same one listed on the receipt I'd found earlier. For 2 agonizing hours, I sat parked in my car, hidden behind tinted windows, watching through the glass. They were sipping wine, leaning in close, laughing at jokes I'd never hear. At one point, he reached across the table and took her hand, and she didn't pull away. You'd probably think I was furious at that moment, but I wasn't. I didn't feel rage or heartbreak. Instead, I felt detached. It was as though I was watching someone else's life crumble, not my own. The woman I saw through that window? She looked like my wife, sure, but she wasn't Olivia. Not the woman I'd built my life with, not the woman I thought I knew. When they finally left the restaurant, I didn't follow them. I already had all the proof I needed. Instead, I drove home, parked in the driveway, and just sat there in the quiet darkness, my thoughts racing. The house felt different when I walked in, cold, unwelcoming. like it knew what had happened. I couldn't stop thinking about all the years Olivia and I had spent together, the life we'd built brick by brick, the plans we'd made for our future. None of it felt real anymore. It was like the foundation of my entire world had been built on sand. By the time Olivia came home, it was nearly midnight. She slipped through the door as quietly as possible, clearly assuming I'd be asleep. I heard the click of her heels on the hardwood floor as she crept toward the bedroom. I could have confronted her right then and there, but I didn't. Not yet. Confrontation is a one-time card, and when I played mine, I wanted it to count. So, I waited. I waited for her to crawl into bed, waited for her breathing to slow and steady as she drifted off to sleep. And as I lay there beside her, staring up at the ceiling, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let this break me. Whatever came next, I would face it on my terms. Olivia and her lover thought they were in control, but they had no idea what was coming. It's one thing to suspect betrayal. It's another to confirm it. But what truly gets under your skin is the arrogance, the sheer gall of the person causing your pain showing up on your doorstep. It happened 3 days after I uncovered the truth. Olivia was out running errands, though I knew exactly where she was. I was sitting at home, pretending to care about the football game on TV, when the doorbell rang. For a second, I thought it might be Olivia, maybe forgetting her keys. But when I opened the door, it wasn't her. It was him. The man on my porch was every bit the smug, polished caricature I'd seen through the restaurant window. His hair was perfectly styled. His suit probably cost more than my car, and his smile, God, that smile, was the kind that made you want to throw something. He didn't even bother to look nervous. No, he looked pleased, like he'd already won some imaginary game we were playing. "Can I help you?" I asked, my tone flat, my face unreadable. "You must be Mike," he said, his voice dripping with fake friendliness. "I'm Eric. I think it's time we had a chat." Eric. So now I had a name for the man who'd wormed his way into my wife's heart. I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe. "What do you want to talk about?" He smirked, shoving his hands into his pockets like he owned the place. "About Olivia. About how things are going to change around here." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Here was this stranger, standing on my porch, telling me how my life was going to unfold. But I didn't laugh. I didn't even flinch. Instead, I stepped aside and gestured for him to come in. "You want me to come inside?" he asked, caught off guard. "Why not?" I said with a faint smile. "We're both adults. Let's have a civil conversation." For a moment, he hesitated, clearly unsure. But his arrogance won out, and he stepped inside. His eyes flicked around the living room, lingering on the photos of Olivia and me that lined the walls. I wondered if he felt any guilt seeing the life he was helping to destroy. Probably not. I led him to the living room and motioned to the chair across from mine. "Have a seat," I said calmly. He started toward the chair, but I stopped him mid-step. "You know," I said casually, "not all battles are fought with words." Eric froze, his eyes narrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" I stood up slowly, my smile never wavering. "It means you walked into the wrong house, Eric." And that's when I hit him. It wasn't a wild, reckless punch. It was calculated. A clean strike that sent him stumbling backward into the coffee table. His smug grin vanished, replaced by shock and pain. He scrambled to his feet, but I was faster. One shove, a twist of his arm, and he was on the ground again, gasping for air. "Mike," he stammered, holding up a hand in surrender. "Wait, let's talk about this." "We were talking," I said, standing over him. "Now we're not." I didn't beat him senseless. That would have been too easy, too impulsive. No, I just left him bruised enough to send a message. By the time I was done, he was curled up on the floor, clutching his ribs and groaning. I grabbed my phone and called an ambulance, not because I cared about him, but because I wanted him gone. When the paramedics arrived, I told them he'd slipped and fallen. They didn't ask questions, and Eric, to his credit, didn't contradict me. Maybe he realized how much worse it could have been. As they loaded him onto the stretcher, I leaned down and whispered, "Stay away from my house. Stay away from my wife. You've already lost this game, Eric. You just don't know it yet." For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. He didn't say a word as they wheeled him out. When Olivia came home later that night, she didn't mention Eric, and neither did I. She acted like everything was fine, like her world wasn't hanging by a thread. I almost admired her composure. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. He thought he was in control. And as for Olivia, she was about to learn that every action, no matter how it's dressed up, carries consequences. The first thing I did was call my lawyer, Greg. Greg and I went way back, college roommates turned lifelong friends. He'd seen me through it all, business disputes, property acquisitions, and now, this? When I laid everything out for him, he didn't bat an eye. "You've got evidence, right?" he asked, his voice calm and pragmatic. "Plenty," I replied, already pulling up the photos I'd snapped outside the hotel, the texts I'd quietly recovered from Olivia's phone while she wasn't looking, and even that damning restaurant receipt I'd found stuffed between the couch cushions. When Greg opened the file I'd sent, he let out a low whistle. "This isn't just evidence," he said, impressed. "This is a damn dossier." "That's the idea," I said. "Now, how do we play this?" Greg outlined a plan that was as ruthless as it was brilliant. First, we'd secure my finances, ensuring Olivia wouldn't have access to a single dime once the divorce process began. Then, we'd introduce the evidence, not in a way that would humiliate her publicly, not yet, anyway, but in a way that left no room for denial or negotiation. This wasn't just about ending the marriage. This was about taking back control. I wasted no time. I began discreetly withdrawing small amounts from our joint accounts, moving them into private ones she couldn't touch. Nothing big, just enough to stay under her radar. At the same time, I started cataloging everything we owned together. The house, the cars, the investments. If this went to court, I wanted a clear record of exactly who had contributed what. But money was only one piece of the puzzle. I needed allies, too. My first target was Olivia's best friend, Anne. She and I had always been friendly, though not particularly close. Over lunch one afternoon, I casually mentioned that Olivia had seemed distant lately, and, never one to shy away from speaking her mind, let out a heavy sigh. "Honestly, Mike, I've noticed it too. She's been different." I wasn't sure if I should say anything. I leaned in, feigning concern. "Do you think she's okay? Is it work stress? Or is it something I've done?" And hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know. She hasn't said much, but there's definitely something going on." She paused, her expression shifting slightly. "Why? What makes you ask?" I shrugged, playing the part of a confused, concerned husband. "I don't know. Just a feeling, you know? You can tell when someone's pulling away." Her face softened. "Mike, I'm sure it's nothing. Olivia loves you. She's probably just going through a phase." "A phase?" "Sure." I didn't push further, but Anne's reaction confirmed everything I needed to know. She suspected something, even if she didn't have the full picture. That suspicion would be useful later. Meanwhile, I kept tabs on her lover. Hospital records are easy to track when you know the right people, and it wasn't hard to find out when he'd been discharged. For all his bravado, he hadn't filed any charges against me, likely because he didn't want to explain why he'd been at my house in the first place. That suited me just fine. The less attention he brought to himself, the easier it was for me to dismantle his life, piece by piece. And then there was Olivia. I started planting little seeds of doubt in her world. A photo of us on vacation, accidentally left on the kitchen counter. A sudden, wistful mention of old memories during dinner. I watched her carefully each time, and though she smiled, it never quite reached her eyes. It was like she was trying to convince herself she still cared. That was the point. Let her stew in her guilt while I worked quietly in the shadows. By the end of the week, I had everything in place. Greg was ready to strike. My finances were secure, and my growing network of information kept me one step ahead of both Olivia and her lover. They thought they were in control. They thought I was just another clueless husband fumbling in the dark. They were wrong. There's something poetic about the silence before a storm. Every sound feels amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the tick of the clock. And when the storm finally breaks, it doesn't just make noise. It demands attention. That Friday evening, the storm came to my door in the form of her lover, for the second and final time. Olivia had told me she was visiting her mother that night. Funny thing, though, her mother lives in Atlanta, and her car was parked at the hotel downtown. I didn't bother tracking her movements any further. I already knew where she was. The doorbell rang, and there he was, looking as smug as ever. His face showed no signs of the lesson I'd taught him days earlier. Fresh suit, fresh haircut, and, apparently, a fresh dose of arrogance. "Michael," he said, his voice dripping with faux civility, "we need to talk." I didn't react, no smile, no frown, just calm, blank indifference. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, like he hadn't expected me to be so accommodating. Then he brushed past me, walking into the house with the confidence of someone who thought they owned the place. It was almost funny. Almost. I motioned toward the same chair he tried to claim last time. "Have a seat." Andrew smirked but didn't sit. Instead, he stepped closer, hands in his pockets, and said, "You've lost, Michael. She's with me now. You're just delaying the inevitable. The sooner you accept that, the easier it'll be for everyone." I stared at him, letting his words hang in the air. There was no anger on my face, no frustration, just the faintest hint of a smile. "You really believe that, don't you?" "It's not about belief," he said, growing cocky. "It's a fact. Olivia and I—" "Stop." I held up a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. My voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that slices through bravado like a knife. "Let's skip the speech, Andrew. You're here for one reason, so get to it." He blinked, momentarily thrown off balance, but quickly recovered. "All right," he said, his tone smug again. "I'm here to make things clear. You're out of the picture, Michael. You've already lost her to me. Deal with it." I couldn't help but chuckle softly. "Deal with it," I repeated, nodding slowly. "Okay." I straightened up, stepping closer. Andrew's smirk faltered slightly, but he didn't move. "Here's the thing," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady tone. "Not all battles end with words." His brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" I didn't answer. In one swift motion, I closed the distance between us. Before Andrew could react, my fist connected with his jaw, wiping that smug smirk clean off his face. He stumbled backward, clutching at his cheek in shock. "What the—" he started, but I grabbed him by the collar before he could finish, shoving him hard against the nearest wall. The impact sent picture frames rattling, one crashing to the floor, but I didn't care. This wasn't about home decor. This was about making a point. "You think you can walk into my house and dictate the terms?" I growled, my voice cold and low. "You think you can take what's mine and walk away unscathed?" Andrew struggled against my grip, but he was no match for me. "Michael, wait. Just—" I cut him off with another shove against the wall for good measure. "You don't get to talk," I snapped. "Not now. You've already said enough." I wasn't trying to put him in the hospital. Not this time, anyway. A few calculated punches, a solid shove, and he was crumpled on the floor, groaning in pain. I stood over him, breathing heavily but steady, then grabbed my phone. "Emergency services," I said, my tone calm, as if this were routine. "I've got an unwelcome guest who had a little accident. He'll need a stretcher." When the paramedics arrived, Andrew was too dazed to put up a fight or argue. I watched from the doorway as they loaded him into the ambulance. Before they shut the doors, I leaned in close, locking eyes with him. "You come back to my house again," I said, my voice low and sharp, "and you won't be leaving in one piece. Do you understand?" His wide, fearful eyes were all the answer I needed. The house felt eerily quiet after they drove off. I sat alone in the living room, nursing a glass of whiskey and staring at the shattered picture frame on the floor. It had been a photo of Olivia and me on our honeymoon, a reminder of a time when everything had seemed perfect. Now, it felt like a relic from a life I didn't recognize anymore. Olivia came home late that night. Her heels clicked softly against the hardwood as she walked in, and I could hear her rummaging through her bag, probably rehearsing some excuse for where she'd been. I didn't get up to greet her or say a word. I just sat there, swirling the amber liquid in my glass, waiting for her to notice the tension hanging in the air. When she finally walked into the living room and saw me, she froze. Her eyes darted to the broken frame on the floor and then back to me. "What happened?" she asked cautiously, her voice careful, like she was stepping onto a minefield. I looked up at her, my expression unreadable. "Nothing you'd be interested in," I replied evenly, taking a slow sip of my drink. Her brow furrowed. "Michael, if something's wrong, just tell me." I chuckled softly, shaking my head. The audacity of her concern was almost laughable. "Something's wrong. All right," I said, setting the glass down on the coffee table. "The question is, do you really want to know?" She hesitated, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of guilt in her eyes. "Michael, what's going on?" I stood, taking my time, and walked over to her. "I could ask you the same thing, Olivia," I said, my voice calm but edged with steel. "What's going on? Where were you tonight? Or last week? Or the week before that?" Her face paled, and she took a small step back. "Michael, Don't lie to me," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "Not again." The room seemed to shrink around us, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down like a suffocating blanket. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes flicked back to the broken frame, as though searching for something, anything, to ground herself. "I know about Andrew," I said, my voice steady and cutting. The name hung in the air like a grenade, and the explosion came in the form of her sharp intake of breath. Her hand flew to her mouth, and her eyes filled with tears. "Michael, Save it." I cut her off, my tone icy. "I've known for weeks. I've seen the receipts, the texts, the meetings at the hotel. I even met him, Olivia. He had the nerve to walk into my house and tell me I'd lost you to him." She staggered back as if I'd slapped her. You knew?" "I knew," I said, crossing my arms. "And I waited. I waited to see if you'd have the decency to tell me the truth. But you didn't. You just kept lying, sneaking around, acting like I wouldn't notice." Her tears fell freely now, and she reached for me, but I stepped back. "Michael, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't apologize," I said coldly. "Not unless you mean it. And even then, it doesn't change anything." She collapsed onto the couch, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of pity for her, but it was quickly swallowed by the cold, hard truth. This was her doing, not mine. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," I said flatly. "We'll discuss the terms in the morning." Her head snapped up, panic written across her tear-streaked face. "Michael, please, don't do this. I made a mistake, but we can fix this. We can." "There's no we anymore," I interrupted. "You made your choice, Olivia. Now I'm making mine." She tried to argue, to plead, but I didn't hear a word she said. My mind was made up. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my future. When she finally realized I wasn't going to budge, she broke down completely. It was pitiful, watching the woman I had once loved reduced to this. But in that moment, I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a cold, unshakable resolve. I walked out of the room, leaving her to her tears. And for the first time in weeks, I felt free. A few days later, when I got home that night, Olivia was waiting for me in the dimly lit living room. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand, stopping her before she could start. "Not now," I said flatly, walking past her without another word. Silence has a way of amplifying everything. Your thoughts, your emotions, your regrets, until they're deafening. Olivia and I lived in the same house, but occupied completely different worlds. Most nights, she lingered in the kitchen, her movements careful and deliberate, as if she were afraid to disturb the fragile tension between us. I stayed in the living room, pretending to watch TV or work, all the while ignoring the weight of her gaze. About a week after Andrew's final humiliation, Olivia cracked. I heard her footsteps long before she appeared. Slow, hesitant, deliberate. When she finally stepped into the room, she looked smaller, fragile even. Her eyes were red, her hair undone, and she seemed older, worn down by guilt. Michael, she said softly, her voice trembling. Can we talk? I didn't respond immediately. I kept my focus on the paperwork in my lap, letting her twist her hands nervously in the silence. Finally, I closed the folder and set it aside, leaning back in my chair. Go ahead, I said evenly. Her shoulders sagged, and she took a tentative step forward. I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking. For everything. For lying. For what I did to us. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but You're right, I interrupted, my tone colder than I intended. You don't. Her face crumpled, and tears welled up in her eyes. Michael, please, she whispered. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but I love you. I never stopped loving you. Love? I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. You think love is sneaking around with another man? Lying to my face? Telling me you're working late while you're at a hotel with him? That's not love, Olivia. That's cheating. She flinched as if I'd struck her, her tears spilling over as she tried to speak. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said, her voice trembling. I don't even know why I did it. I don't know. Lost. Confused. Lost? I echoed, shaking my head in disbelief. That's a nice way to justify ruining a marriage. Her knees buckled, and she sank onto the couch, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to reach out and remind her of the love we'd once shared. But the other part, the part that had been shattered by her betrayal, kept me rooted in place. I'll do anything to fix this, she pleaded through her tears. Therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. Please, Michael, don't give up on us. I stared at her for a long moment, my emotions warring within me. Finally, I spoke, my voice low but firm. There is no us anymore, Olivia. You killed it the moment you chose him over me. Her sobs grew louder, and she buried her face in her hands. I'm sorry, she whispered over and over, as if the words could somehow undo the damage. I stood, unable to watch her crumble any longer. I'm going to bed, I said curtly. We'll discuss the divorce papers in the morning. Her cries followed me up the stairs, a haunting echo of the life we'd lost. The next day, just as I was beginning to settle into the clarity of my decision, a new threat emerged. It came in the form of Andrew's younger brother. I hadn't heard of him before, but it was clear he'd inherited Andrew's arrogance, though not his intelligence. The first time I noticed him, he was outside my office, leaning casually against a lamppost. He didn't approach me, just watched as I walked to my car. The next day, he was at the coffee shop I frequented, loitering by the door. Again, no words, just an unsettling presence. Finally, on the third day, he made his move. Michael, he said, stepping into my path as I left work. He was taller than Andrew, lean but wiry, and his eyes gleamed with a dangerous intensity that Andrew had lacked. We need to talk, he said. Do we? I replied, not breaking stride. He grabbed my arm, forcing me to stop. You hurt my brother. I shook him off, narrowing my eyes. Your brother walked into my home and made himself a problem. I solved it. You think this is over? Andrew may have backed down, but I won't. I stepped closer, lowering my voice to a calm, steady tone. Let me make something clear. If you're here to intimidate me, you're wasting your time. If you're here to fight, you'll leave worse off than he did. And if you're here to stir up trouble, I'll make sure you regret it. He glared at me, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged, and he didn't like it. Finally, he stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. This isn't over, he said, his voice dripping with venom. For your sake, it should be, I replied, brushing past him as I headed to my car. He's done this to her. Anne's words hit me like a punch to the gut. What do you mean? I asked, though a sinking feeling in my chest told me I already knew. She leaned in, her voice low but urgent. Andrew targets married women, she explained. He finds the ones who are vulnerable, convinces them they deserve better, and then ruins their lives. It's not about love, it's about control. A power trip. He doesn't care about them, Michael. He just gets off on the chaos he creates. I stared at her, the pieces falling into place like the final turns of a cruel puzzle. Andrew wasn't just an arrogant opportunist. He was a predator. Knowing this didn't make the situation easier. It made it infinitely worse. I wanted to tell Olivia, and added, her voice heavy with regret, but she wouldn't have listened to me. She was too far gone. I nodded, the knot in my stomach tightening. Thank you, Anne, I said. You've helped more than you know. Andrew's games are about to end. Andrew, emboldened by the rumors he'd spread and his petty victories, decided he wasn't done yet. He wanted to go out with a bang, or so he thought. His final attempt to confront me was nothing short of a spectacle. It happened at a charity gala I was attending for work. The event was black tie, a polished affair meant to exude class and sophistication. But Andrew, being Andrew, couldn't resist the chance to stir up chaos. He arrived uninvited, dragging his brother along for backup. They walked into the room like they owned the place, their smug confidence radiating across the room. It didn't take long for them to spot me. Andrew beelined toward me, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of a small crowd. Michael, he called out, his tone mocking and theatrical. How does it feel to lose everything? Your wife, your reputation. What's left for you now? I turned to face him, keeping my expression calm, neutral. I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Andrew, I said evenly, you've always talked too much. Why don't I show you how actions speak louder than words? Before he could respond, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small stack of documents. The papers were neatly stapled and pristine, a sharp contrast to the mess Andrew had tried to create. You might want to take a look at these, I said, holding the stack out to him. He hesitated, his bravado faltering, but curiosity got the better of him. He snatched the documents and began flipping through the pages. It didn't take long for his expression to shift from smug confidence to wide-eyed panic. What is this? He stammered, his voice cracking. It's your life, Andrew, I said, my tone calm, almost conversational. Your unpaid debts, the businesses you've bankrupted, the investors you've burned. And let's not forget the restraining orders filed by women who've seen through your lies. Andrew's hands trembled as he shuffled through the damning evidence. The small crowd around us murmured, their curiosity turning into judgment as they caught glimpses of the documents. His brother looked like he wanted to disappear. You think you're untouchable, I continued, stepping closer, my voice low and steady. But here's the thing. Predators like you thrive in the shadows. You rely on people staying silent, too ashamed or scared to fight back. Well, I'm not afraid of you, Andrew. And now, everyone knows who you really are. Andrew's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. His world, the one he'd built on lies and manipulation, was crumbling right before his eyes. This isn't over, he finally muttered, his voice weak and shaky. I leaned in, close enough for only him to hear. Oh, it's over, I said, my tone sharp enough to cut. You just haven't figured it out yet. He stood there, frozen, as the weight of his exposed secrets pressed down on him. The crowd around us began to disperse, their disinterest clear now that the show was over and the villain had been unmasked. When I got home that night, Olivia was waiting for me again. She looked even more fragile than before, her eyes rimmed red from hours of crying. As I walked past her, she opened her mouth to speak, but I stopped her with a simple hand gesture. Not now, I said firmly, not even bothering to look at her. There were still battles to fight, but Andrew's chapter was finally closing. As far as I was concerned, he was already a footnote in a story that was no longer his to tell. The house felt emptier than ever after the gala. Silence clung to every corner, amplifying the weight of everything that had happened. Olivia and I existed under the same roof, but we might as well have been strangers. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of peace. The storm Andrew had tried to bring into my life was over. He thought he'd won, but in the end, he was the one left scrambling to pick up the pieces. And as for Olivia, her reckoning wasn't far behind. The divorce went through quietly. No drama, no drawn-out battles. I think she finally understood the depth of her betrayal and knew there was no way back. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of closure. As for me, I began to rebuild. Piece by piece, I put my life back together. My reputation recovered, my work stabilized, and I started moving forward. I found peace in knowing that I had faced betrayal head-on and come out stronger on the other side. And then I stayed in touch. Her honesty and support had been a rare comfort during one of the most turbulent times of my life. One night, as I sat alone in the house that no longer felt like home, I allowed myself to reflect. Everything that had happened, the betrayal, the revenge, the redemption, it had all played out like a twisted game of chess. And in the end, I had won. Not because I had destroyed Andrew or his brother. Not because I had exposed Sarah's lies. No, I had won because I had reclaimed something far more important. My life, my dignity, and my peace. And that, I realized, was the ultimate victory. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Let us know in the comments.